Okay. What I was going to talk about was another tool for interpretation, but it slipped my mind, and it'll come back to me. It's pretty important. Okay, but another thing to remember is that the Bible includes the history of mankind. There are other writings outside of the Bible that give more detail, give a different perspective. Basically, what was I going to say? What was I going to say?
I think you're on a brain fart.
Yeah. There's another tool for interpretation. Has to do with when I was talking about. Oh, I know. I can edit it. When I was talking about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, there's another tool for interpretation. Okay. Anyways, I'm gonna just start throwing out some verses and some concepts having to do with things being upside down, backwards, figurative, literal. And I had this conversation with my brother the other night, and things were just flowing out really nice. So I'm going to try and think back to that conversation so I can give some examples. But I'll kind of take a progression. I'll jump around the Bible a little bit. But one example is there's a verse in Genesis that talks about, it says, for this reason, whatever the reason is, we don't need to talk about that. But for this reason, a man shall leave his mother and father, shall cleave to his wife, the two shall become one flesh. I have been to, I can't even count how many weddings, and not just Baptist weddings, but other types of weddings at different types of churches where the pastor or the preacher or whatever you want to call him, the minister, uses this verse within the marriage ceremony. And in my experience within the church, because as an elder we had to deal with a lot of people going through marriage issues and people going through divorce. And so the church likes to use this verse as an example of marriage, the marriage of a man and woman being a God-ordained, God and a God-blessed and a God-sanctioned union between a man and a woman, and that there is a mystical union between the two that turn them into one flesh. Now, is this literal? In a spiritual sense, maybe, possibly, yes. I mean, if you look at the actual mechanics of what happens energetically when a man and a woman have sexual union, and by the way, this whole subject is somewhat uncomfortable and taboo within the church. We don't talk about sex a lot, which is really strange. But anyways, a sexual union between man and woman is, there is something energetically that takes place. I mean, obviously, it's one of the most powerful creative forces in the world because you create life that way. But what is the verse saying? A man and a woman can't get divorced because when they get married and they have sex, they become one flesh. That's how it's used within those messages, like this mystical union that takes place. That's not what the verse is saying. Let's talk about what it's really saying. The practical, in-your-face, down-to-earth interpretation of those words. The two become one flesh. A man leaves his parents, cleaves to his wife or has sex with her, and the two become one flesh. What does that mean? They have a baby. They have a child. The DNA from the parents meld together and form this new life, which has traits of the mother and father. That's it. Simple as that. So that's an example of the church taking something and turning it into something it's not. And like I said, there's hundreds of examples of this. Yes, okay, the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve. Yes, there was a first man, and yes, there was a first woman. That whole story is very complex. An interesting issue directly related to that is their first two children, Cain and Abel. And we assume they were adults when this happened, but they had an argument, had a fight. The older brother, Cain, which was supposedly and apparently Adam and Eve's first child, killed his younger brother Abel. And when God God knew this took place, that blood had been shed, and when God confronted Cain about this, and told him he was going to be punished and he would be cast out of the garden, Cain says, "But if I go out into the world, people will want to kill me." Well, I brought this up to some high-level people in the church when I was there. This was one of my questions. If Cain and Abel were the first children of Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve were the first human beings on the planet, who are these people in these cities that Cain was afraid of? Where did they come from? And I mean, how do you reconcile this? Where did these people come from? And the answer I got was that, well, maybe Adam and Eve would, people back then lived a lot longer. They could have had a lot of other children who went out and had left the garden and built these cities and created civilizations and had inbred children, which back then wouldn't have been such a bad thing genetically, but created cities of people. That doesn't make sense. There's a much simpler, more common sense answer to this, and that is Adam and Eve were not the first beings on the planet. And this begins to actually make sense when you think about the Garden of Eden being this enclosed little experiment where these gods, the Elohim, remember, who created the heavens and the earth, who are actually angels or lower beings below the prime creator, who were given authority to oversee the earth and the creation of the earth. And there's a whole story behind this of what's really going on, but you can begin to see where this is going. That they were the ones who created mankind, modern man, as we think we know modern man, as we are today. And then they were the ones who were the Nephilim, the fallen angels who came down here and had sexual intercourse with human beings and created this alternate race known as the Nephilim, this race of giants or whatever you want to call them. And so Adam and Eve were not the first people or beings on this planet. They were a genetic experiment. This completely, totally goes against the doctrinal teachings of the modern church. But I have to say that it makes more sense, because there's too many strange contradictions and unexplainable things within the interpretation of the church's interpretation of what the Bible says. There are other issues. jump to Exodus chapter 20, Ten Commandments. I'll come back in a minute and talk about this.